When years ago, when I was just starting as a storyteller, and I had also just moved up to Pittsburgh, going to grad school here. I went home for the holidays every year because, well, that's kind of where family was. I didn't have any particular reason to stay up here. On this one occasion, I'd gotten back. It was a couple of years into my being up here, which meant I'd been away from home long enough that I didn't really have contact with friends from school from years past. So mostly I spent the time around with my parents. A couple of days after the holidays, after Christmas, they were heading off to some neighbors for a party. It was both a uh, holiday open house and also a welcome home party. The couple had a son, actually about my age, who'd been traveling around the world. I spent the last year out and about. Now, this was years ago, before internet cafes could be found pretty much every place. And so communication was mostly postcards and occasional airmail letter. He'd been keeping in touch until about 3 or 4 months ago. He'd been in India and they had just lost contact. I hadn't heard from him since, until just all of a sudden he showed up on their doorstep on Christmas Eve. Well, they already had this holiday party planned, so they quickly added on a welcome home element as well. So we went. There was other people from the neighborhood and friends and family of the couple and such, and everyone was down in the basement of the house. And there were people of all ages, a lot of kids of various ages as well, who did in fact start to get bored with everything. And as they did, finally, this fellow who'd been traveling said, why don't I take the kids into the back room there and tell some stories? Well, that sounded like a good idea to everyone. And so they all trooped off into the back room. And as I said at the beginning, I was just starting to be a storyteller in those days. And so I was kind of intrigued to hear what he had to tell. And so I followed along. And I said other room. It was really just the back end of the basement where they had thrown up a wall to make kind of a division. Put in a door. There was some rugs inside. He stood at the far end against the basement wall, and the kids filled in on the rugs and pillows. And there was really just one kind of easy chair there that by the door, and I took that. We closed the door so we wouldn't bother the folks on the main party. And this guy, as I said, started to tell stories. And he started with old folk tales and legends that he'd picked up along the way as he traveled around the world. And that slowly drifted into also stories of his own adventures and things that he'd done. And finally, one of the kids asked, well, did you ever see anything scary? Were you ever really scared? And well, he thought for a bit. And he said, well, yeah. There was this one time I was in India. I was staying in a small village. And one evening I went out. The twilight was coming on. It was starting to finally get cool. So I went to take a walk before it got dark. I followed path out of the village and through the fields into the jungle nearby. There were still some patches of jungle around, and I'd been walking for a little bit, and I started to get that creepy feeling you sometimes get, that something is following you. And so at one point I stopped and I turned to look, but there was nothing there. Well, not on the path anyway, but 100 yards behind me or so, I could see bushes swaying off to the side of the path. But I wasn't sure. I mean, maybe there was something in the brush, or maybe there'd just been a breeze. I couldn't remember. And so I turned and I kept walking. But that feeling persisted. And so again, I turned and I looked, and again, the path behind me was empty. But the bushes off to the side were moving. I'd been paying attention this time. And so I knew there was no wind. There was something there. And it looked a little bit closer than it had been the first time. So whatever it was following me. So I turned and I kept walking, kind of wondering what it was. And again, I turned and again looked, and again, the bushes moving and a little bit closer. Maybe 70 yards back now. As I turned, I started to wonder, well, maybe I wanted to head back. But of course, to head back would take me past whatever it was. And while I was thinking of that, I recalled hearing some of the villagers talking about a tiger that had come into the area. It turned man killer. Indeed, it had attacked some of the men taking care of the herds more than once, and had even come into the village a few days before. The village headman's young son, infant son, had been in a cradle, wrapped up in a blanket, pinned tight with a brooch on the porch of the man's house, and the tiger had come and taken baby and blanket and everything away. And I began to wonder if that was what was behind me in the jungle. If so, well, I sure didn't want to turn around and walk back towards it. So I kept going, walking faster now. But again, when I turned, I saw the bushes moving and still a bit closer. Whatever it was not only following, but closing in. I kept going, hoping that maybe the trail would loop around back to the village before the tiger could get too close. I started looking for trees that maybe were big enough for me to climb up to get away from it. But I'd already passed all the large trees. Indeed, the jungle seemed to be coming to an end. The scrub and brush getting thinner. Up ahead, I could see open sky. And I did step out finally beyond the edge of the jungle. And there was a broad field, maybe 40, 50 yards across. And then at the far end of it, I could see a ridge of high hills. But as I looked, I could see dark patches that might be caves or crevices. And I wondered if I could get there before the tiger got too close, maybe I could find one of those caves that was big enough for me to get in and hide, but too small for the tiger to follow after. It was my only hope, and so quickly I started across the meadow. As I reached the hills, I turned, I looked back, and as I did, the tiger came out of the jungle. It stood there. It spied me. It was big. 4 feet or more at the shoulder, 10 foot long, a long tail twitching behind it. Its ears flickered in the faint evening breeze. It gave a low growl as it looked right at me. Well, with that, I turned and I started to scramble up the hill. A flash of light caught my eye, and when I looked up, I could see there was a ledge and a cave beyond, and maybe that would do. So I started to scramble up, and as I got up on the ledge, pulled myself up, there was a small glass brooch sitting there on the rock. And the setting sun reflecting in that must have been what caught my eye. And so I looked about, and there was the cave that I'd hoped. I looked down, and there was the tiger at the base of the hill. It looked up, and its tail twitched ever so slightly, and it started to climb. Well, at that, I dropped the brooch, and I turned and headed into the cave. And at first, it did what I'd hoped. It got smaller and smaller until finally I had to drop down on hands and knees. And just as I did, the light behind me went out. And I knew that meant the tiger had come in behind me. And so now I had to keep scrambling, hoping the tunnel would get smaller, but it did not. It stayed the same size. And the size was large enough for the tiger to pass. My hope now was that maybe it went all the way through the hill, and I could get out to the other side and still have enough time to find some other crevice to hide in that the tiger couldn't reach me. It wasn't a good hope, but it was the only one I had. And so as I was thinking about that and wondering how deep is this hill, how much further till I come to some opening, maybe that's why I didn't notice it at first. Notice that the floor beneath my hands and feet was not rough and rocky the way you'd expect the floor of a cave to be, and it was smooth and polished. And so too were the walls on either side and even the ceiling above me, all smooth as if polished by something large and soft moving back and forth across them over many long years. And then I noticed the smell of tiger heavy in the air. And then I heard it, the tiger's growl, but not from the tiger behind me, but instead from the tiger's den up ahead. Well, he stopped there. And after a moment, one of the kids finally got up the nerve to ask, well, how did you escape? And he looked at us and he said, escape? There was no escape. You see, I am a ghost. And at that instant, the lights went out. And of course, kids started to scream and holler, and I reached up trying to find the light switch, which I knew was above my head. And finally, I hit it and the lights went on, and he was gone. And at that, instant pandemonium and panic as every kid wanted to get out of there and came swarming right over me because I was sitting blocking the way to the door. And so as they were climbing over me and I'm fumbling to get the door open, and finally the door, and we all fled the room. And of course, there he was in the other room, waiting for us. And we all had a laugh at this joke he'd managed to pull off somehow. And the party went on. But it wasn't until late that night, when I was back at home in bed, and you know how sometimes you're lying in bed just thinking back over the things that happened over the day, that it occurred to me. In that back room of that basement, there was only one door, only one way in or out. And that was to climb over me to get to the door. And in the few seconds that the lights were out, nobody left the room at all. And that's the story of the tiger. Get a bit of water here. And all right, I was talking earlier today in one of my classes about Irish immigration, and indeed the Irish potato famine, which is where this next story starts. So it's the story of the farm from the northern part of Ireland, up in Ulster. Old man McCann swore that he was not going to divide his farm. When he died, he let both of his sons know that one of them would inherit the entire farm. But he never said which one. This was somewhat common in those days. It was not long after the potato famine. 1845, a fungus, a blight from North America, hit the potatoes that so many of the Irish lived on. Such a nasty infection, it rotted potatoes in the field. Some were dug up in the morning looking perfectly fine, and by evening had melted into black, viscous goo. The second year, 46, the same thing happened. There were wet years that allowed fungus to spread quickly. By the third year, 47, when it hit, everyone had used up whatever reserves or supplies they'd had. And in the west of Ireland, where people lived on tiny farms to begin with, and there was a lot of poverty, the potatoes were the only food. Starvation now stalked the land. And where starvation stalks, epidemic quickly follows. Cholera and typhoid swept the land. During those 3 years, the population of Ireland shrunk from 9 million to 6 million in 3 years' time. 1.5 million dying of famine and plague. And those that survived, well, they'd seen the horrors. Even up in the north, where the plague hadn't hit, they didn't depend upon potatoes up there, but still, they'd seen what had happened. And like many, old man McCann had been thinking about it, and he realized part of the problem was the way that the Irish had always handed down land. When a father died, his farm was divided equally among all his sons. And so that meant every son had a farm to start with, a little bit of land to start a family. But it also meant that year after year, the farms got smaller and smaller until they were too small for a family to survive when emergencies came. And so McCann had sworn that was not going to happen to his family. The farm would stay intact. One son would get it all. Now, over in England, of course, it would be obvious that Tom, the eldest, would inherit, because that's how they'd always done things in England. But there was no such tradition in Ireland. And old man McCann remained silent, like many fathers in those days, because this kept both of his sons working. Tom and his younger brother, Andrew, both working hard on the farm, hoping to impress their father with their efforts so that when the time came, they would inherit. It was tough, working like that, free labor on the farm. And it meant you couldn't get married. I mean, what woman was going to take a chance on a man who might end up a penniless, unpaid worker for his brother? Well, Sally was willing to take a chance because she knew Andrew was a hard worker. Andrew had skills besides farming. He could do some carpentry, some work. He was known to be a good hard worker. So even if he didn't inherit, he'd find work. Men would hire him. His skills would be needed. They might not thrive and prosper, but they wouldn't starve either. And Sally was willing to take the chance. And so the two were wed. And Tom was furious, because he saw now that there was all the more reason for Andrew to get the farm with a wife. And then Sally was pregnant. That was it. Obviously, Andrew and Sally were going to inherit because now there were children. There's the grandchildren at stake. Well, if that's the way it was going to be, Tom was not going to wait around being free labor so that his brother could prosper. He'd leave and try his chances elsewhere. Decided to emigrate to America. Well, the day came for his departure. Friends and family gathered to see him off. In those days, they held what they called the immigrant wake, because it was usually a one-way trip. You weren't coming back. Folks weren't going to see you. There wouldn't be a wake when you died, so this was it. They held it in the barn. That's where Tom had spent most of his time. Now, the two brothers had divided up the farm work, and Tom liked working in the barn. He did the milking twice a day. Cows come into their stalls, and he'd go at it. He repaired equipment. He tended things there. Andrew had preferred to be out in the fields, keeping an eye on things out there. So it was fitting. The farewell was in the barn. When the party done, time for Tom to say his farewells, went around to the family one by one. Last of all, he came to Sally. He looked at her a moment, and then he stepped forward and opened his arms to embrace her. And everybody thought, well, this is good. You know, even as he's leaving, he's at least mending the quarrel between them. No. As he embraced Sally, he leaned in and whispered in her ear, "This is your fault. You stole my farm from me, and I will get it back." And then he stepped back. He smiled. He took the hat off his head and he put it on the shelf by the door, like he'd done every morning and every evening before doing the milking. Almost like he was claiming his spot. And then he picked up his bags and he walked out. Out the farmyard and down the road, never turned to look back. And that's the last they saw of him. Now, Andrew and Sally, they had a son, and a second, a daughter as well. Old man McCann, when he died, of course, Andrew and Sally inherited the farm. And everything went well. Occasionally, they'd hear from friends or relatives who had emigrated to America, would send back word saying, "Hey, we saw Tom. Tom was in New York, Philadelphia, Chicago, working for the railroads." Though they never heard from Tom himself. And then one day, Andrew was coming in from working out in the fields. It was coming in towards evening. As he was coming into the cottage, he passed Sally heading to the barn. Sally regularly did the milking and heading off to get to it. And he didn't think anything about it. But he'd almost reached the house when he heard Sally scream. And with that, he dropped what he was doing. He turned, he went running back, and he burst into the barn. Just in time, to see Sally kneeling there in the center of the barn, and someone standing over her with their hands around her throat, choking her. And on an instant, Andrew recognized it was Tom. And he shouted, "Tom, no!" And he charged forward and he leapt. And he flung his arms out to grapple with his brother and pull him off of Sally. But as he did, his arms just passed through empty air. He tumbled to the ground. And when he looked up, there was no Tom. There was no one in the barn but himself and Sally, gasping for breath. Bruises already starting to show up on her throat. They couldn't explain it. No sign of Tom or anyone else that they might have confused for him. And they said nothing more about it. But a few days later, the same thing happened. Sally was going into the barn for the evening milking. Andrew just passing by, and just out of the corner of his eye again, he saw a figure step in after her. And then he heard her scream, and again he came running, and again there she was, kneeling on the ground, and the figure over her, Tom, with his hands round her throat, throttling her. And again Andrew cried out, "Tom, no!" And he charged, and he dove right at him and grabbed, and his arms passed through the empty air. And Tom was gone. After that, Sally wouldn't go to the barn anymore, and Andrew quite willingly picked up the milking. But about a week later, he was putting his kids to bed, his eldest son, and the son looked at him and asked, Dad, who's that man in the barn every night? He said, "What are you talking about?" "Well, the man working in the barn. Sometimes I get up in the middle of the night, the way you have to do. And I look out the window and I can see there's lights, like someone's got a lantern in there, and you can hear someone working and moving about. Who's the man in the barn?" Well, Andrew had no answer, but that night, after he'd put the kids to bed, he waited up. Late at night, he did hear the sounds of someone moving about in the barn, some work being done. And when he looked out, he could see light coming the cracks between the boards, like there was a lantern lit inside. He got out of the house. He slipped over to the barn. He eased open the door, and he looked inside. It was empty, and it was dark. There's no lights at all. He could just make out the cattle in their stalls, but they were easy. They were quiet, like nothing had been disturbing them. Tom, nothing to be seen of him. Andrew stepped back, just wondering what was going on. Just a few days after that, they got the letter. Came with a postmark from Canada, some place called in Saskatchewan. They opened it. They didn't recognize the name upon it. It was somebody from the new Tom, though. The letter explained they didn't know him, but he knew all about them because he'd worked with Tom on the railroad. They'd been working the railroad running across Canada, putting it across the Canadian prairies there. And Tom had often talked about this farm back in Ireland, family. Well, then Tom had gotten sick not too long ago. And there weren't a lot of doctors in the rail camps. And the ones that were there, not very good. Tom just got sicker and finally died. Was buried there out on the prairie. But the fellow wrote the letter, said, he figured the family would want to know what happened to Tom. And so he just wanted to let them know. But his brother had thought of him and remembered the farm, and he'd gone on. But what really caught Andrew's eye was the date. The date that Tom had died. It was the same day and date that Tom had first appeared in the barn with his hands around Sally's throat. Well, after that, they didn't want to make use of the barn anymore. It cost more than they could afford, but they built another barn on the other side of the house. Moved everything over there. And on the day when they did that and moved everything over and they were done, Andrew went into the old barn and he looked about that big empty space. And he called out, "All right, Tom, you win. It's all yours." And then he took Tom's old worn hat that they'd kept all these years, put it back on that shelf, just as Tom had left it. And then Andrew stepped out, and he closed the doors, and he barred them. And no one ever set foot in that barn ever again. And that's the story of the farm. All right. A little drink here. And that story did come from a collection of true ghost stories from Ireland. That's how they presented. Fellow, actually a priest back 1890s, said about collecting, put out notices in newspapers all around Ireland, and people sent in stories, and that was my version, the slightly more elaborated version of what was sent into him. Somebody said about their family farm. As with this next one as well. Since we're getting in close to Halloween, it's the time for this story. And again, one I found in that same collection. But it's set much closer to Dublin, in fact. Small town out in the Irish countryside. A new priest had been sent. We replaced the old priest who'd been there many years until he'd finally retired. So Father Patrick sent out a young fellow, brought new energy to the parish, to the town. And Patrick set to work and getting the church upright. Thomas really liked him. Thomas was one of the altar boys, 12, 13 years old. And he enjoyed serving, being up there to help the priest with the mass, bringing the bread and wine up at the right times. And Thomas was one of the more reliable. Some of the boys, they'd show up sometimes and not on others. Some of the boys were quite casual about getting their robes on properly and maybe wiping their noses when they had a bit of a cold upon the sleeves of the robes. But not Thomas. Thomas was dependable, to be relied upon. And Father Patrick liked that. He came to rely upon Thomas. Now, more than once, Thomas would be sitting in a pew with his parents, just praying before the beginning of service. And then he'd feel a hand on his shoulder and hear Father Patrick whisper in his ear, "Thomas, I need you." And Thomas didn't even ask questions. At that point, he knew that somebody hadn't shown up. One of the other boys had forgotten what he was supposed to do. And Thomas would just hurry to put on his white robe and the red kata over it and hurry up to be ready to help with the service. Well, Father Patrick, in turn, rewarded Thomas by scheduling him to serve on all the important days of the church calendar. So Thomas got to be the altar boy for Christmas and for Easter, for Pentecost, for All Souls. Well, Thomas, he paid enough attention in Sunday school and such to know that All Souls really wasn't one of the big major days of the year. Medium importance at best. But Father Patrick insisted. I mean, he loved All Souls. He said, that's the day in which the souls of all those who had died during the year would gather for one last time, for one last set of prayers, one last service with their loved ones before going on to their reward or punishments, depending on which awaited them. Thomas knew this wasn't actually church doctrine. This bit about the souls waiting all year round for this one day. In fact, Thomas knew it went way back beyond that, because he'd heard his grandmother telling the same thing. But to hear her tell it, this was an idea that went all the way back before Christian times, to the ancient peoples. But he wasn't going to correct the priest on theology. And if Patrick enjoyed the service, well, what did it hurt? What did I say? Patrick was there for about 3 years in that parish before a sudden heart attack. Surprising for a man so young, but something his heart stopped, and there was nothing anyone could do. It's right at the end of October, and so service was scheduled to be held, the burial. The body was laid out for the people to come and do their last respects and their prayers on All Hallows Eve. The service would be held on All Souls. That seemed appropriate, given how much Father Patrick had loved the day. His family was supposed to come up from Dublin as well. But at the last minute, they sent word there'd been a problem with the trains and they were delayed. They were wondering if somebody would be able to stay after the service at the church to let them in so they could pay their last respects before the funeral service the next morning. So this message had been relayed, and the caretaker of the church had agreed he would do that, and Thomas had offered to sit with him. And so the villagers all came, and Father Patrick was laid out in his coffin, in his vestments, his priestly robes and everything, candles set at one on each corner of the coffin. Then, after everyone had paid their respects, said their prayers, one by one, folks drifted away, and leaving just the caretaker and Thomas sitting up in the front pews right close to the coffin. The candle's still burning, but the rest of the church allowed to go dark. You could hear the wind outside, the roof kind of creaking as the wind blew over it. And finally, there was a knock on the door, but it turned out it was not Father Patrick's family, but someone from the caretaker's family, for his daughter had fallen ill. He was needed at home. But Father Patrick's family was coming, and so Thomas told the man, go ahead, I can take care of it. It's just letting people in so they can say their prayers. And so we did. And the caretaker left and the door closed, and there was Thomas sitting there all alone in the big, dark church. Said he could hear the roof creaking, the floorboards too. Almost like the whole church settling, almost like footsteps, it sounded like. And sometimes the creak of the pews. Again, the church settling, but it sounded like people sitting down, taking their seats. There was a soft, sighing wind, almost like the breeze had gotten in through an open window and was blowing through the nave itself. Although the candles around the coffin didn't flicker. Thomas was beginning to regret his offer to stay and watch. I was thinking of his own bed at home, and I should be safely in that, the blankets tucked around tight, when suddenly he felt a hand on his shoulder, and a voice whispered low in his ear, Thomas, come quickly. I need you. And as was his habit, Thomas didn't even think twice. Without even realizing he was doing it, he was up on his feet, and he hurried around to the sacristy, the room off to the side where everyone gets robed and ready for the service. And there he found his robes, the white and red, where he put them up after the prayers had been done. And he pulled it back over his head, straightened everything up so he looked neat and proper, as he should. And then he stepped out to the area up by the altar. And the candles on the altar were lit. And there was Father Patrick, standing by the altar. The missal laid out, and Father Patrick began the Mass. And at the points in which the congregation was to respond to prayers, there was often a whispering of wind, a rustling sound throughout the nave, almost like a congregation softly saying, Amen. Thomas didn't look, kept his eyes fixed upon the altar, upon Father Patrick, didn't want to look out into the darkness of that nave. But he couldn't help but think about the people who had died over the previous year. Mrs. O'Malley from the farm outside the edge of town. Or the old innkeeper a couple miles down the road. That young kid who'd gotten really sick, the bad fever back in the summer, and one by one, Thomas remembered all the people from the surrounding area who had died during the year. And just then, he heard that soft sighing again, like a congregation whispering, Amen. And then it was time for the Eucharist itself, for communion. It was time for Thomas to bring up the bread and wine, and starting to wake, he realized Father Patrick was looking at him and beckoning time, and so quickly he grabbed them, that there was bread and wine sitting there on the side table, ready for a Mass. Without thinking, he picked these up and he brought them out. But as you can imagine, he wasn't too steady at this point, and his hand shaking. Indeed, shaking so bad, the hand holding the glass cruet filled with the wine, that the wine sloshed over and spilled down a dark red stain on the white sleeve of his robe. And at that, Father Patrick reached down to take the wine, the bread, but also to put his hand upon Patrick's. And he looked down so their eyes met, and he said, Thomas, focus, calm. Thomas took a deep breath and then allowed Patrick to take the elements from him, put them on the altar. And then Patrick took the elements of the communion and he headed for the altar rail. And again, in the night, in the darkness, Thomas could hear a stirring, shuffling, as if a congregation coming forward to accept their communion. Although Thomas kept his eyes fixed firmly on the tips of his shoes and did not dare look up, much less look out. And then finally, the service done. There was a faint sound, almost like a congregation singing. And then a stirring in the church, in wind, a creaking. And then the sounds passing out towards the main doors. And the church was empty and dark. And there was a knocking on the side door, and Thomas started awake to find himself sitting by the coffin once more. The knocking continued, and he remembered Father Patrick's family must have come, and so he jumped up and he ran, he opened the door, and sure enough, their train had finally arrived. And they were so glad to see that there was someone in the church with their relative and someone to let them in so they could come and pay their respects as well. And so they did. And as they came in, and one by one, they went to the coffin to kneel and to pray. When they were done, Thomas showed them back out. Father Patrick's mother was the last to go. And in the door, she stopped. And again, she thanked Thomas for waiting. It meant so much to her that she was able to come and do this. But, she said, you didn't need to keep your robes on. You could have changed. We would have been fine. And Thomas looked down and saw that indeed he did still have his white robe on. And when he looked at the sleeve, it was stained dark red and damp with wine. All Hallows Mass. Another story from that collection of supposedly true Irish ghost stories sent in. I think the fellow who compiled the book said the original letter to him came from someone who had actually been there or heard the tale firsthand or something. But you can make of it what you will. Also, feel free to respond with all the different responses. Our little reaction buttons there if you want. And also, as I said, feel free to put questions up in the chat. I'll be happy to answer what I can when we're done. Maybe we have time for one more tale, and then, yeah, anything you want to know about the stories or anything else, we'll let you know. Meanwhile, looking down at my list of tales here to find a good one to end on. Oh, sorry, I was just caught by one I have not told this Halloween season, nor in fact I think I told it last year, so it's probably about time. Bringing this home to our side of the ocean, since we've had a couple of Irish stories. This is one from down Arkansas way. Probably 100 years ago, or maybe a bit further, somewhere around in there. You know, Arkansas, the Ozark Mountains, lightly settled, and well, there were folks around. Dancing was a popular pastime, and folks like to gather on a Sunday evening, and local musicians come, and there'd be dancing, square dancing, and such. Now, it's not a real rich area, not now, not then. And so having a pavilion or something, a building just set aside for use just on Saturday night just didn't make sense. And sometimes maybe you could use somebody's barn, but barns are used for all other sorts of purposes as well. There's not always a lot of room in them. But down in the Ozarks, there are a lot of caves. And if you had a cave nearby that had a big chamber in it with a more or less flat floor, well, now that might end up being your dance hall. Faralloon Cave was one of those. It was one of the best, in fact. As you came up to the rock face, the hillside where the cave entrance was, first there was an overhang jutting out a good 10, 15 feet to make like a little covered porch, which is good on a damp night or something where you could shake off the damp, cold, pull off your outer coat before heading in. There's a passage in, good enough that you could walk in, and no more than about 100 yards back or so, that passage winding around and opened up into a large chamber, which did indeed have a mostly flat floor. At the far end, there was even a raised bit of rock there, like a platform, which made a perfect stage to put the musicians up on. And there was even room to put tables off to the side for piling the refreshments. Best of all, it had great acoustics in there. The way the music echoed off of those rock walls and the high ceiling there, why, it made an average musician sound good, and good musicians sound great, and a musician like Jim Anderson sound just fantastic. And Jim was a fiddler, and he'd come just about every Saturday night because he loved playing there in Farallone Cave. As I said, it just made his fiddling sound so good. He'd play with the rest of the band, and lots of other musicians liked to come for the same reason. And they all knew each other, and they all liked playing with Jim. Or there was another reason too that Jim liked playing in Farallone Cave. That's where Sarah Ann Teasdale would go to dance. Oh, and she was something to watch. Her long yellow hair streaming out behind her when she'd twirl around in a swing. Her bright blue eyes bright like the summer sky, and a smile to match. And she was a good dancer. And the good dancers always end up right up front, right by the band, so Jim could watch. And he had eyes for no one else but Sarah Ann. Well, he was determined. He'd go talk to her. Always determined, but like a lot of musicians, when he stopped playing and set his instrument down, Jim would turn kind of shy and awkward. And well, before going off to go and talk to Miss Sarah Ann, he'd need a glass of cider just to wet his throat, because it was hard work at that fiddle. Or maybe a piece of that pie, because he was hungry from all that playing, or there'd be someone else he needed to talk to first, something he needed to arrange, or, well, he'd always have an excuse. And by the time he was ready to go talk to her, the break would be done. It'd be time to get back up on that rock ledge and start playing again. And Jim would be telling himself, next week for sure, I'm going to talk to her. But then there came the week when she danced with Frank Clinton every dance. And when the break came, Sarah Ann and Frank, well, they went off down one of them side passages together. Well, that's another thing about old Farallone Cave. It had these side passages that went deeper down under the mountain, deeper into the caves. Down there was a whole labyrinth of caves down there. Even the Farallone River itself, flowing down there under the mountains, no one was sure if it ever came up to the surface. It was just right for young couples to take advantage of the break and the dancing, slip down there in the dark, sit along the riverbank, and enjoy each other's company in private. So when Jim saw Sarah Ann and Frank head off for one of them side passages, he realized he'd lost his chance. He'd waited too long. Well, he didn't even stop to set his fiddle down, didn't stop to get a cup of that cider. He just headed off down a different one of those passages to be alone in the dark. Some of the other musicians seeing him go, well, they just let him go there because everybody knew how he felt about Sarah Ann. And everybody'd seen Sarah Ann head off with Frank. Now, when Jim didn't come back after the break to rejoin the band, or everyone just figured he'd slipped off on his own, unnoticed. But when somebody went by his cabin about 2 days later and saw not only was Jim not there, there's no sign that anybody'd been there since Saturday. Well, the folks got worried. Started asking around, and sure enough, nobody'd seen him, not since the dance. Nobody'd seen him leave the dance. Nobody'd seen him go home. Search parties were organized, and this time they went down into the cave. Down into those side passages, crossed the Farallone River into that labyrinth beyond. Big maze of caves down in there going off in different directions, passages here and there deep under the roots of the mountains. Searching for Jim, calling for Jim. Every once in a while, somebody'd hear a fiddle playing far off in the dark and figure, well, that's Jim calling for help. But the way sound would echo down in that maze of caves, you couldn't tell where it was coming from. And by the time you'd figured it out and made your way to the right place, Jim was gone and somebody else miles away in another part of the maze would be hearing that fiddle going. They searched for days. And finally, it was time they had to admit that there's no way Jim could still be alive down there without food, without water, down in the dark and the cold. It was time to stop searching. There was a memorial service. And for a while, the dances, they were held elsewhere out of respect. But the time went on, and Far Lone Cave was too good of a place to never use again. So after a decent interval had gone by, the dances moved back and folks returned. But things were a bit different now, because young couples going down those side passages during the break would come running back saying they heard a fiddle playing across the river. Now, most folks put it down to little brothers sneaking on ahead to disrupt a courting session. Most folks. But some had gone down there into the dark, and they'd listened. And they'd heard that fiddle playing. And see, the thing is, good musicians, great musicians like Jim, they'll have their own way of playing, their own special style. It's like a signature, almost like a fingerprint. It's unique to them. And folks who knew music went down under the mountain there and listened and heard that fiddle playing far off in the dark. Well, there's only one person who could play a fiddle like that. Jim Anderson. But it couldn't be Jim. Could it? And that's the tale of Far Lone Cave. So a few stories to get you ready for Halloween week and the holiday coming up. So thanks very much for coming out. Again, say anyone's got questions you want to throw into the chat there. I'm glad to answer whatever I can. I already told you about the two stories that came. I've been thinking ahead, knew I was going to tell those stories. I even grabbed the book so you can find it. That last one from a collection of Ozark stories, collections from down the Ozark Mountains that I got years ago. And the first one, actually, I'll tell you the heart of that story, all the stuff, the pieces from the fella in India. Well, that's actually a story written by Lord Dunsany, one of the founders of modern fantasy, called The Tiger. And you can find that in a lot of books and collections of ghost stories. But then I put the whole framework around it and put the little twist at the end that brings it back to being ghost. So that's where all of those came from. All right. So say thanks everyone for coming here, for turning out. I do hope you enjoyed those stories as much as I enjoyed sharing them with you. So thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Alan. And thank you everyone for joining us. I will send a follow-up email. So if you did have any questions that you think of after the fact about any of the stories or about storytelling in general, I'm sure I can get those passed along for you. But for now, thank you again. And I hope everyone has a great night.
Have a happy Halloween.
Halloween.